Flagships are understood as the best Starfleet has to offer. The most advanced hulls, the finest crews, the most critical missions. They represent the Federation's commitment to exploration, diplomacy, and defense. They are symbols, and symbols do not always serve the interests they represent. The USS Enterprise has been destroyed, disabled, or compromised in nearly every configuration it has carried that name. The flagship designation has been worn by vessels lost to enemy action, sabotage, temporal anomalies, and catastrophic system failures. Ships carrying that name have been abandoned, self-destructed, stolen, and decommissioned under circumstances that would end the careers of captains commanding vessels with less political weight. Yet the name persists. The designation persists. The symbolic value of the flagship is treated as more essential than the operational risk it concentrates. This is not about the quality of the ships or the competence of their crews. This is about how Starfleet uses flagship assignments as instruments of narrative control. Flagships project the appearance of stability and strength during periods when the Federation is under strategic pressure. They are deployed not only to solve problems, but to be seen solving problems. That visibility creates constraints. It forces command decisions to prioritize symbolic continuity over tactical flexibility. And when the flagship is lost or compromised, the Federation does not reconsider the model. It builds another one. The deeper mechanism is this. Flagship assignments concentrate authority, prestige, and institutional momentum in a single vessel. That concentration makes them useful for projecting coherence during crises, but it also makes them targets. And it makes their failure more destabilizing than the failure of any other ship in the fleet. Starfleet knows this. It accepts the risk because the alternative, distributing that authority across less visible platforms, would require acknowledging that the Federation's strength is not embodied in a single ship. It would require letting go of the myth. The flagship is not Starfleet's best ship. It is Starfleet's most visible ship. And that distinction changes everything. Starfleet operates on a doctrine of distributed strength. The fleet is composed of thousands of vessels spanning dozens of classes, each optimized for specific mission profiles: explorers, science vessels, light cruisers, tactical frigates, hospital ships, transports. The diversity is strategic. No single loss cripples the fleet. No single engagement determines the outcome of a war. Resources are spread across sectors, and command authority is delegated to regional admirals and sector commanders who operate with significant autonomy. The flagship does not fit this model. It is singular by definition. It carries the flag officer responsible for representing Starfleet's interests in a given theater, or, in the case of the Enterprise, for representing the entire Federation. That officer is not simply a tactical commander. They are a political figure. Their decisions carry institutional weight beyond their immediate operational context. When Captain Picard negotiates with the Romulans, he does so as the face of Starfleet. When Admiral Kirk confronts the Klingon Empire, his authority is assumed to reflect the Federation's official position, even when it does not. This creates a structural contradiction. The flagship is expected to operate with the same flexibility and independence as any other deep space explorer, but it cannot. Every action it takes is interpreted as a statement of Federation policy. Every failure is treated as a failure of the Federation itself. The ship becomes a platform for symbolic projection, and symbolic projection requires consistency, visibility, and control. The cost is predictable. Flagship captains are not free to act in their own best tactical interest. They must consider how their actions will be perceived by allies, adversaries, and the Federation public. They must maintain the appearance of strength even when retreating would be the wiser course. They must preserve the ship even when sacrificing it would achieve a greater strategic objective. The flagship is too valuable to risk and too visible to hide. The Enterprise D was the most advanced exploration vessel in the fleet when it launched. It was also the most exposed. By the time of its destruction at Viridian II, it had been boarded, hijacked, infiltrated, and disabled more times than any comparable Galaxy-class starship. That record is not explained by weaker shields or inferior crew training. It is explained by mission profile. The Enterprise was sent into situations where other ships would have been considered expendable. It was sent because Starfleet needed the visible success, or because the symbolic cost of failure was deemed acceptable if it occurred under the right narrative conditions. The Battle of Wolf 359 illustrates the inverse. The Enterprise was not present. Captain Picard had been assimilated by the Borg and was actively commanding the cube that destroyed the fleet. Starfleet sent 39 ships to intercept. The flagship was not among them, not because it lacked the firepower, but because losing the Enterprise would have been a narrative failure Starfleet could not afford. The Federation needed to believe the Enterprise could still be saved. It needed to believe Picard could still be recovered. That belief required keeping the ship out of the engagement even though its presence might have altered the outcome. 11,000 Starfleet personnel died at Wolf 359. The Enterprise survived, and when Picard was recovered, the ship returned to active duty without significant consequence. The loss of the fleet was treated as a tactical defeat. The preservation of the flagship was treated as a victory. The distinction reveals what Starfleet prioritizes when the two objectives conflict. Flagship deployments follow a pattern. They are assigned to theaters where Starfleet expects success or where failure can be narratively contained. The original Enterprise under Kirk was sent to explore the frontier, engage in first contact, and represent the Federation in negotiations with rival powers. These are high-visibility missions with significant political consequences. The ship was rarely deployed in situations where total loss was likely, not because Kirk avoided danger, but because Starfleet avoided sending the flagship into scenarios where its destruction would destabilize the Federation's strategic position. The exception proves the rule. When the Enterprise was sent to investigate the Genesis planet in the aftermath of Khan's attack, it was technically a salvage and evaluation mission. The ship was operating under orders that kept it close to Federation space and within range of support. Kirk disobeyed those orders, stole the ship, and took it into Klingon-controlled space. The vessel was destroyed. Starfleet did not replace it immediately. The designation sat unused for years while a new ship was constructed. The gap was not due to resource constraints. Starfleet builds ships constantly. The gap existed because the symbolic weight of the Enterprise name required a ship worthy of carrying it, and that ship had to be ready to project the same message of strength and continuity the previous vessel had carried. When the Enterprise A was commissioned, it was not the most advanced ship in the fleet. It was a Constitution-class refit, a design already decades old. But it carried the name, and the name carried the message. The Federation endures, Starfleet endures, the Enterprise endures. The actual ship was less important than what the ship represented. This is the flagship's function. It is a narrative anchor. It allows the Federation to point to a single vessel and say, "This is what we are." That message is politically useful during periods of uncertainty. It reassures allies. It signals resolve to adversaries. It provides the Federation public with a tangible symbol of their government's strength. But narrative anchors are not tactically flexible. They cannot be risked lightly. They cannot be deployed in ways that contradict the message they are meant to project. The Enterprise D was sent to Romulus to investigate Vice Proconsul Emret's defection. It was sent to the Romulan neutral zone to respond to the destruction of outposts along the border. It was sent to Quanos to transport Chancellor Gowron during the Klingon Civil War. These are not exploration missions. They are diplomatic and intelligence operations where the presence of the flagship signals Federation commitment. The ship is there to be seen, not merely to act. When the Enterprise is not visible, Starfleet's position weakens. During the Dominion War, the Enterprise E was conspicuously absent from major fleet engagements. It was assigned to patrol the neutral zone, a low-intensity posting far from the front lines. The official explanation was strategic. The ship's advanced systems were too valuable to risk in fleet actions where it could be destroyed by mass Dominion forces. The operational explanation is different. Losing the Enterprise in a battle Starfleet was not certain to win would have been a catastrophic symbolic defeat. The Federation public needed to believe the flagship was safe, that it was being held in reserve for a critical moment, that its absence was part of a larger strategy rather than an admission that Starfleet could not protect its most famous vessel. The Enterprise never saw that critical moment. It remained on the neutral zone until the war ended. Its absence from major engagements meant it contributed nothing to the fleet actions that determined the war's outcome. But it also meant it could not be lost. And that preservation allowed Starfleet to maintain the illusion that the flagship was still relevant, still central to the Federation's strategic posture, even when it was sidelined. The symbolic function of the flagship creates a second-order problem. It attracts adversaries who understand that destroying or capturing the vessel achieves a political objective beyond its tactical value. The Enterprise has been targeted by Klingons, Romulans, Borg, and rogue Starfleet officers precisely because its loss destabilizes the Federation's narrative cohesion. The ship is not simply a military asset, it is a psychological asset, and psychological assets can be attacked through symbolism as effectively as through firepower. The Borg understood this. When they assimilated Picard, they did not simply gain access to Starfleet tactical data. They gained the ability to use the Federation's most recognizable captain as a weapon against the Federation's most recognizable ship. Picard's assimilation was not a random act of opportunity. The Borg selected him because his identity was inseparable from the Enterprise's identity. Turning him into Locutus turned the flagship's symbolic power against itself. The Enterprise could not destroy the cube while Picard was aboard without destroying the very symbol it was meant to preserve. Starfleet's response was telling. It did not replace Picard. It did not reassign the Enterprise. It committed resources to recovering him, even though those resources could have been used to rebuild the fleet after Wolf 359. The decision was not purely tactical, it was narrative. The Federation needed Picard back because losing him permanently would have meant admitting the Borg could take anything, even the identity of the flagship's captain. That admission would have undermined the entire symbolic architecture Starfleet had built around the Enterprise. The Klingons learned the same lesson during the destruction of the Enterprise D. Commander Lursa and B'Etor did not target the ship because it was the most dangerous vessel in the sector. They targeted it because destroying the Federation flagship would have enhanced their political standing within the Klingon Empire. The actual engagement was secondary. The symbolic victory was the objective. And when the Enterprise's saucer section crashed on Viridian 3, the loss was treated as a propaganda coup by Klingon hardliners, even though the ship had already been decommissioned in favor of the Sovereign-class Enterprise E. That replacement reveals another constraint. Starfleet cannot allow the flagship designation to remain attached to a destroyed vessel. The Enterprise name must transfer to a new hull quickly enough to prevent the symbolic gap from being exploited by adversaries. The speed of replacement matters more than the operational readiness of the new ship. The Enterprise E was commissioned ahead of schedule and deployed to frontline operations before its shakedown cruise was complete. The urgency was political. Starfleet needed the name back in service. It needed the public to see that the flagship had been restored. The tactical risk of deploying an untested vessel was acceptable because the symbolic risk of delay was not. This creates a cycle. The flagship is exposed to disproportionate risk because its visibility makes it a strategic target. Its loss creates political pressure to replace it immediately. The replacement is rushed into service, often before it is fully ready, which increases the likelihood of system failures, tactical errors, and eventual loss. The cycle repeats, and each iteration reinforces Starfleet's dependence on the flagship model because abandoning it would require admitting the model was flawed. The political infrastructure surrounding the flagship makes abandonment nearly impossible. Fleet admirals, sector commanders, and Federation Council members have built their careers on the assumption that the flagship represents the Federation's strength. Removing that symbol would force them to articulate a new basis for Federation cohesion, one that does not rely on the visibility of a single vessel. That articulation is politically difficult. It requires admitting that the Federation's power is distributed, decentralized, and less visually dramatic than the myth suggests. It requires letting the public see Starfleet as it actually operates, rather than as it is symbolized. Starfleet has never taken that step. Instead, it has doubled down. The Sovereign-class Enterprise E was more heavily armed than its predecessor. The Constitution-class refit that became the Enterprise A carried more firepower than the original Constitution design. Each replacement is built to carry more visible strength than the last, not because the missions require it, but because the symbol requires it. The flagship must always appear to be the best, even when other ships in the fleet are more advanced, more tactically versatile, or more strategically positioned. This is where the flagship becomes a liability. It locks Starfleet into a pattern of visible escalation that its adversaries can exploit. The Romulans know that any significant incursion near the neutral zone will draw the Enterprise. The Borg know that any direct threat to Federation space will require the flagship's involvement. The Dominion knew that sidelining the Enterprise was a strategic victory even without engaging it. The ship's predictability is a function of its symbolic role. It cannot act freely because its actions must reinforce the message it is meant to project. The constraint is not limited to tactical decisions. It extends to command appointments. Flagship captains are selected not only for their competence but for their ability to embody the values the Federation wants to project. Kirk was chosen because he represented the bold frontier spirit of early Starfleet exploration. Picard was chosen because he represented the diplomatic, intellectual maturity of the next-generation era. These are not purely operational decisions, they are casting decisions. The captain must fit the narrative Starfleet is telling about itself. This creates a secondary problem. Flagship captains operate under different constraints than other captains. They are expected to take risks that would be considered reckless for lesser-known commanders because those risks reinforce the narrative of courage and resolve. But they are also expected to avoid failures that would damage the flagship's symbolic value. The balance is impossible to maintain consistently. Either the captain prioritizes the mission and risks the ship, or they prioritize the ship and compromise the mission. In either case, the symbolic weight of the flagship distorts the decision-making process. Picard's encounter with the Temerians at Darmok illustrates the problem. He beamed down to the planet's surface alone to meet with Captain Dathan, leaving the Enterprise without its commanding officer in a situation where communication had already failed and conflict was likely. The decision was tactically questionable. It left the ship under the command of his first officer during a potential first contact crisis. But it was symbolically necessary. The Federation needed to be seen taking the risk, making the effort, committing to understanding an alien species even at personal cost. Picard's willingness to put himself in danger reinforced the message that the flagship represents exploration and diplomacy, not just military power. The mission succeeded, but the success was not guaranteed. If Dathan had been hostile, if the Temerian vessel had attacked the Enterprise while Picard was incapacitated, the outcome would have been different. The flagship would have been lost or damaged, and the Federation's symbolic narrative would have suffered. Starfleet accepted that risk because the alternative, refusing the encounter, would have been an admission that the flagship prioritizes self-preservation over its stated mission. That admission would have undermined the entire justification for maintaining a flagship at all. The contradiction is structural. The flagship is supposed to embody the Federation's values, but those values often require accepting risks that threaten the ship's survival. Starfleet cannot resolve the contradiction without either abandoning the flagship model or redefining the values it claims the flagship represents. It has done neither. Instead, it has relied on the competence of flagship crews to navigate impossible situations and the luck of narrative continuity to ensure that failures are never catastrophic enough to force a reckoning. That luck has limits. The Enterprise has been destroyed twice in configurations carrying the name. It has been disabled, captured, and sabotaged more times than any other ship class in recent service. Each incident is treated as an isolated failure rather than a pattern. Starfleet investigates, issues new protocols, upgrades systems, and reassigns personnel. But it does not question whether the flagship model itself is the source of the vulnerability. It cannot. Questioning the model would require admitting that the Federation's most visible symbol of strength is also its most consistent point of failure. The flagship's role in the Khitomer Conference reveals how far Starfleet will go to preserve that symbol. Chancellor Gorkon was assassinated by conspirators using a Starfleet vessel to make it appear the Enterprise had fired on the Klingon ship. The evidence pointed directly to Kirk's crew. The political pressure to sacrifice the Enterprise to allow the Klingons to hold it accountable was immense. The peace process depended on Klingon trust, and that trust could not survive if Starfleet appeared to protect the officers responsible for killing their Chancellor. Starfleet did not sacrifice the ship. It allowed Kirk to operate independently, to investigate the conspiracy, to expose the real culprits, even though doing so meant risking the peace conference. The decision was not made because Kirk's investigation was certain to succeed. It was made because losing the Enterprise to Klingon justice would have been a symbolic defeat Starfleet could not afford. The flagship could not be seen as subordinate to Klingon authority, even when the alternative was jeopardizing the most significant peace negotiation in Federation history. The conspiracy was exposed. The conference succeeded. But the success depended on Kirk's ability to deliver results under impossible conditions. If he had failed, the Enterprise would have been lost, the conspiracy would have remained hidden, and the Federation would have been blamed for the collapse of the peace process. Starfleet gambled the entire Khitomer framework on the symbolic necessity of preserving the flagship. The gamble paid off. But the willingness to take that gamble reveals how deeply the flagship model has embedded itself in Starfleet's institutional logic. The Enterprise is not the only flagship. The Sovereign-class USS Yorktown, the Nebula-class USS Prometheus, and other vessels have carried flag officers and represented Starfleet in high-visibility operations. But none of them carry the same symbolic weight. None of them are treated as irreplaceable. The Enterprise designation is unique, and that uniqueness creates a different set of constraints. Starfleet can afford to lose other flagships. It cannot afford to lose the Enterprise. And that asymmetry forces decisions that would not be made for any other vessel in the fleet. The question is not whether the flagship model provides value. It does. The Enterprise has achieved diplomatic breakthroughs, first contact successes, and tactical victories that other ships could not have accomplished. But those successes come at a cost. The ship is over-deployed, overexposed, and over-relied upon. It is sent into situations where its loss would be catastrophic, and it is expected to succeed where failure is not an option. That expectation creates pressure on the crew, on the captain, and on Starfleet Command to make decisions that prioritize symbolic continuity over strategic flexibility. The result is a system where the flagship operates under constraints that do not apply to the rest of the fleet. It is too visible to be expendable, too important to be risked, and too symbolic to be allowed to fail. Those constraints do not make the ship weaker, they make it predictable, and predictability is a vulnerability that adversaries understand how to exploit. The deeper issue is what the flagship model reveals about the Federation itself. Starfleet maintains the flagship because the Federation needs a symbol it can point to when its distributed, decentralized power structure becomes difficult to communicate. The flagship simplifies the narrative. It allows the public, the member worlds, and allied governments to see the Federation's strength embodied in a single vessel. That simplification is politically useful, but it is also strategically dishonest. The Federation's strength is not concentrated in one ship. It is spread across thousands of vessels, hundreds of starbases, and dozens of member fleets. The flagship does not represent that strength. It represents the need to make that strength visible in a way that can be easily understood and easily defended. and that need creates a system where appearances matter more than outcomes. Starfleet builds flagships not because they are the most effective way to project power, but because they are the most effective way to project the appearance of power. The distinction is subtle, but it is critical. Effective power allows Starfleet to act freely, to deploy resources where they are needed, to accept losses when necessary, and to prioritize mission success over symbolic preservation. The appearance of power requires maintaining the flagship even when its deployment is inefficient, even when its survival becomes more important than the mission it is supposed to accomplish, and even when its symbolic value outweighs its tactical contribution. Starfleet has chosen the latter. It has built an institutional structure around the flagship model that prioritizes visibility, prestige, and narrative control over operational flexibility. That structure serves the Federation's political needs, but it constrains Starfleet's ability to act strategically. The flagship cannot be risked, cannot be hidden, and cannot be allowed to fail in ways that would undermine the message it is meant to project. Those constraints do not make the Federation weaker in absolute terms, but they do make it less adaptable. And adaptability is the defining requirement of deep space exploration and interstellar conflict. The flagship model survives because the Federation has never been forced to choose between symbolic continuity and strategic necessity. Every time the Enterprise has been destroyed, Starfleet has been able to replace it. Every time the ship has been compromised, the crew has been able to recover it. The pattern holds because the Federation has the resources to maintain it and the political will to absorb the cost. But the pattern is not sustainable indefinitely. At some point, the flagship will be lost in a way that cannot be narratively contained. At some point, the symbolic value of the Enterprise will collide with a strategic reality that does not allow for recovery, replacement, or redemption. When that moment comes, Starfleet will face a choice. It can abandon the flagship model and accept that the Federation's strength is distributed rather than embodied. Or it can double down, build another Enterprise, and continue the cycle. The choice will reveal whether the flagship serves Starfleet or whether Starfleet serves the flagship, and the answer will determine whether the Federation can adapt to threats that do not respect the symbolic architecture it has built around a single name. The institutional momentum behind the flagship is not limited to Starfleet Command. It extends into the Federation Council, the civilian government that ultimately controls Starfleet's budget and strategic priorities. Council members from core worlds and frontier colonies alike have invested political capital in the idea that the flagship represents their interests. When the Enterprise negotiates a treaty, explores a new sector, or intervenes in a regional conflict, it does so as a representative of the entire Federation. That representation creates political ownership. Council members can point to the flagship's successes as evidence that their government is effective, that their principles are being upheld, that their resources are being used wisely. This creates a feedback loop. The more the flagship succeeds, the more political capital is invested in maintaining it. The more political capital is invested, the harder it becomes to question whether the model is strategically sound. The flagship becomes insulated from the kind of critical evaluation that other Starfleet assets are subjected to. When a sector patrol vessel is lost, Starfleet investigates and adjusts deployment protocols. When a science ship is destroyed, the loss is mourned but accepted as part of the risk inherent in deep space exploration. When the flagship is compromised, the response is institutional crisis management. The loss is treated not as an operational failure, but as a political emergency that requires immediate remediation. The Enterprise sees destruction at Narendra III illustrates the political dimension of flagship loss. The ship was responding to a distress call from a Klingon outpost under Romulan attack. It was outnumbered and outgunned. The tactical situation was hopeless. Captain Garrett chose to engage anyway, sacrificing her ship and crew to defend the Klingon outpost. The action had no immediate strategic value. The Enterprise C was destroyed. The outpost was eventually overrun. But the symbolic value of the sacrifice was immense. The Klingons interpreted the Enterprise's intervention as proof that the Federation was willing to honor its commitments even at catastrophic cost. That interpretation became the foundation for the Khitomer Accords and the Federation-Klingon alliance that followed. Starfleet did not order Garrett to make that sacrifice. She made the decision independently, knowing the ship would be lost. But the decision was only possible because the Enterprise C was a flagship. The symbolic weight of the name gave the sacrifice meaning that the loss of any other ship would not have carried. If the USS Yorktown had intervened and been destroyed, the Klingons might have appreciated the gesture, but they would not have interpreted it as a statement of Federation policy. The Enterprise designation transformed a tactical loss into a political asset, and that transformation justified, in Starfleet's assessment, the continued investment in the flagship model. The problem is that not every sacrifice produces a political return. The Enterprise C's loss at Narendra 3 was strategically fortunate. The Klingons chose to interpret it as an act of honor rather than an act of desperation, but that interpretation was not guaranteed. If the Klingons had viewed the sacrifice as evidence of Federation weakness, as proof that Starfleet was willing to throw away its most prestigious assets in futile gestures, the outcome would have been different. The flagship model depends on adversaries and allies interpreting symbolic actions in ways that benefit the Federation. When that interpretation fails, the symbolic investment becomes a liability. The flagship's symbolic function also creates tension within Starfleet itself. Officers assigned to the Enterprise are acutely aware that their actions will be scrutinized more closely than those of officers serving on less visible vessels. Career advancement within Starfleet is influenced by performance evaluations, mission success rates, and command endorsements. Service aboard the flagship is prestigious, but it also carries risk. A single mistake, a single failed mission, can damage an officer's career more severely than the same failure aboard a ship without the flagship designation. The pressure to perform is higher, the margin for error is smaller, and the consequences of failure are more severe. This creates an incentive structure that prioritizes caution over innovation. Flagship officers are less likely to take tactical risks that might jeopardize the ship, even when those risks could produce significant strategic gains. They are more likely to follow established protocols, defer to command authority, and avoid actions that could be interpreted as insubordination or recklessness. The culture aboard the flagship becomes conservative, not because the officers lack courage or creativity, but because the institutional consequences of failure are disproportionately severe. Captain Riker's brief command of the Enterprise D during Picard's absence illustrates the dynamic. Riker was an experienced first officer with a strong tactical record, but his command style aboard the Enterprise was noticeably more cautious than his behavior in lower-stakes situations. He deferred to established protocols more consistently, consulted with senior staff more frequently, and avoided unilateral decisions that might have been justified tactically but would have been difficult to defend institutionally. The shift was not a function of Riker's competence. It was a function of the flagship's symbolic weight. Command decisions aboard the Enterprise are not evaluated solely on their tactical merits. They are evaluated on how they affect the ship's reputation, Starfleet's credibility, and the Federation's political standing. The flagship model also affects crew retention and morale. Service aboard the Enterprise is prestigious, but it is also exhausting. The ship is deployed more frequently than comparable vessels. It is sent into high-risk situations more often. It is expected to perform at a higher standard under more intense scrutiny. Officers who serve aboard the flagship for extended periods report higher levels of stress, burnout, and psychological strain than officers serving on other deep space explorers. Starfleet compensates for this by offering accelerated promotion tracks, commendations, and priority assignment to command positions. But the compensation does not eliminate the underlying problem. The flagship demands more from its crew than other ships do, and that demand takes a toll. The Enterprise D's encounter with the crystalline entity provides a case study in how symbolic constraints shape operational decisions. The entity had destroyed multiple Federation colonies and caused thousands of deaths. Dr. Keela Ma, a civilian scientist with expertise on the entity, was aboard the Enterprise to assist in the investigation. She advocated for destroying the entity using a sustained graviton pulse. Picard refused. He argued that the entity was a form of life, that destroying it without first attempting communication would violate the Federation's principles, and that the Enterprise's mission was exploration, not extermination. The decision was defensible on ethical grounds, but it was also a decision shaped by the flagship's symbolic role. Picard understood that the Enterprise could not be seen as a weapon of indiscriminate destruction. The ship's reputation as an explorer and diplomat depended on it being perceived as acting in accordance with Federation values, even when those values conflicted with immediate security concerns. If the Enterprise had destroyed the entity without attempting communication, the action would have been criticized as militaristic, reactive, and inconsistent with the principles the flagship was supposed to embody. Picard chose to prioritize the symbolic message over the tactical objective. The entity was eventually destroyed by Dr. Ma, acting independently, but the Enterprise's role in the incident remained consistent with its symbolic function. The cost of that consistency was borne by the colonies the entity might have attacked if the opportunity to destroy it had been delayed further. Picard's decision prioritized the flagship's reputation over the immediate safety of Federation civilians. The prioritization was not made callously. It was made because the flagship's symbolic value is understood to serve the Federation's long-term interests, even when it conflicts with short-term tactical gains. But that understanding is built on an assumption that may not hold. The assumption is that maintaining the flagship's symbolic purity provides more value to the Federation than the tactical advantages that could be gained by allowing the ship to act without symbolic constraints. Starfleet has never tested that assumption rigorously. It has never deployed the flagship in a way that openly contradicts its symbolic role to determine whether the political cost would exceed the tactical benefit. The flagship operates within a narrow band of acceptable behavior, and that band is defined not by what is tactically optimal but by what is symbolically sustainable. The result is a ship that is less operationally flexible than its capabilities would otherwise allow. The flagship model also affects how Starfleet allocates resources. The Enterprise receives priority access to experimental technologies, upgraded systems, and advanced weaponry. It is assigned the best engineers, the most skilled tactical officers, and the most experienced medical personnel. These allocations are justified on the grounds that the flagship represents the Federation's best, and therefore it should be equipped with the best resources available. But the allocations come at a cost. Resources directed toward the flagship are resources that cannot be directed toward other vessels. The Galaxy-class USS Odyssey, destroyed by the Jem'Hadar during the initial contact in the Gamma Quadrant, did not receive the same level of technological support as the Enterprise D despite being the same class. The disparity is not explained by operational necessity. It is explained by symbolic priority. This creates inefficiencies. Starfleet could distribute advanced systems across multiple vessels, increasing the overall capability of the fleet and reducing the risk that a single loss will eliminate access to critical technologies. But doing so would dilute the flagship's symbolic superiority. The Enterprise must be seen as the best, and being seen as the best requires concentrating resources in a way that is tactically suboptimal. Starfleet accepts the inefficiency because the symbolic value of the concentration is understood to justify the cost. The flagship's symbolic role also shapes how Starfleet communicates with the Federation public. The Enterprise's missions are publicized more extensively than those of other ships. Its successes are celebrated. Its crew members become public figures. Captain Picard's memoirs, Captain Kirk's historical significance, and the cultural prominence of the Enterprise name are all products of deliberate institutional communication strategies designed to reinforce the flagship's symbolic value. Starfleet does not publicize the achievements of the USS Saratoga or the USS Akagi with the same intensity, not because those ships are less successful, But because their success does not serve the same symbolic function, the communication strategy creates a distortion. The Federation public believes the flagship is uniquely capable, uniquely important, and uniquely representative of Starfleet's mission. That belief is not entirely inaccurate, but it is incomplete. The flagship is capable, but so are hundreds of other ships. It is important, but its importance is partly a function of the symbolic investment Starfleet has made in promoting it. It is representative, but only of a narrow slice of Starfleet's actual operations. The distortion serves a purpose. It allows the Federation to maintain public confidence in Starfleet's effectiveness without requiring the public to understand the complexity of distributed fleet operations. But the distortion also makes it harder for Starfleet to move away from the flagship model, because doing so would require admitting that the public's understanding of Starfleet's strength has been shaped by institutional messaging rather than operational reality. The flagship model's sustainability depends on Starfleet's ability to continue replacing lost or damaged vessels quickly enough to prevent symbolic gaps. That ability, in turn, depends on industrial capacity, resource availability, and political will. During peacetime, Starfleet can afford to invest in flagship construction and maintenance. During wartime, the calculus changes. Resources that might have been directed toward building a new enterprise are redirected toward building tactical frigates, patrol vessels, and hospital ships that serve immediate operational needs. The flagship becomes a luxury Starfleet cannot afford, or a symbolic necessity it cannot abandon. The Dominion War tested this tension. The Enterprise E was kept away from major fleet engagements, ostensibly to preserve its advanced systems. But the preservation was also symbolic. Starfleet could not afford to lose the flagship during a war it was not certain to win. The risk was not that the ship's loss would eliminate a critical tactical asset. The risk was that the loss would undermine public confidence in the Federation's ability to protect itself. The flagship's absence from major battles was a tacit admission that symbolic preservation had become more important than tactical contribution. And that admission revealed the true function of the flagship more clearly than any mission profile or command directive ever could. The flagship is not designed to win wars. It is designed to make the Federation believe it can win wars. That belief is valuable, but it is not the same as actual capability, and when the two diverge, Starfleet prioritizes the belief. The Enterprise's role in first contact scenarios further illustrates how symbolic constraints shape operational behavior. First contact is one of Starfleet's core missions. The Enterprise has been involved in more first contact events than any other vessel in the fleet. That record is not accidental. Starfleet assigns the flagship to first contact missions because the ship's presence signals that the Federation takes the encounter seriously. The flagship represents the Federation's best, and deploying it for first contact communicates respect, commitment, and peaceful intent. But the symbolic value of the deployment creates risks. First contact scenarios are inherently unpredictable. The new species may be hostile, technologically superior, or culturally incompatible with Federation values. The Enterprise's involvement in these encounters places the flagship in situations where miscommunication, misunderstanding, or conflict could result in the ship's loss or damage. Starfleet accepts that risk because the symbolic value of the flagship's presence is understood to outweigh the tactical danger. The Enterprise D's encounter with the Sheliak corporate illustrates the dynamic. The Sheliak are a non-humanoid species with no interest in Federation diplomacy and a legal claim to a planet inhabited by human colonists. The Treaty of Armans, negotiated decades earlier, granted the Sheliak control of the planet. Picard's task was to relocate the colonists before the Sheliak arrived to claim their territory. The mission was not exploratory. It was not diplomatic in the traditional sense. It was a legal and logistical operation that required negotiating with a species that viewed the Federation with indifference bordering on contempt. The Enterprise's involvement in the mission was symbolic. The flagship's presence signaled that the Federation was honoring its treaty obligations, that it was committed to protecting its citizens, and that it was willing to engage with species that did not share its values. The mission succeeded, but the success was not guaranteed. The Sheliak could have interpreted the Enterprise's presence as a violation of the treaty. They could have responded with force. The flagship would have been placed in a position where defending the colonists would have meant violating a treaty the Federation was legally obligated to honor. The symbolic value of deploying the Enterprise created a risk that a less visible ship would not have carried. The flagship model also affects how Starfleet handles internal dissent and ethical dilemmas. Flagship captains are expected to embody Federation values, but those values are not always clear or consistent. The Prime Directive prohibits interference in the internal affairs of pre-warp civilizations, but it does not provide clear guidance on how to balance non-interference with the moral obligation to prevent suffering. The flagship is expected to navigate these dilemmas in ways that reinforce the Federation's ethical reputation. That expectation limits the range of acceptable responses. Captain Picard's decision to violate the Prime Directive to save the Baku from forced relocation illustrates the constraint. The Baku were a pre-warp society living on a planet with unique regenerative properties. The Sona, working with certain Starfleet officers, planned to forcibly relocate the Baku to harvest the planet's resources. Picard determined that the plan violated the Federation's principles and chose to intervene, even though doing so meant defying Starfleet orders and risking his career. The decision was ethically defensible, but it was also a decision shaped by the flagship's symbolic role. Picard understood that the Enterprise could not be complicit in forced relocation without undermining the Federation's moral authority. The ship's reputation as a defender of Federation values depended on it being seen as acting in accordance with those values, even when doing so conflicted with Starfleet's immediate strategic interests. Picard's willingness to defy orders was possible because the flagship's symbolic weight gave him the institutional credibility to challenge command authority without being immediately relieved of duty. A captain commanding a less visible vessel would not have had the same latitude. Defying Starfleet orders aboard a sector patrol ship would have resulted in immediate reassignment and court-martial. But Picard's actions aboard the Enterprise were treated as a principled stand rather than insubordination. The flagship's symbolic value protected him from consequences that other officers would have faced. That protection reinforces the flagship model by demonstrating that the ship operates under different rules than the rest of the fleet. But it also creates a precedent where flagship captains are expected to prioritize symbolic purity over operational discipline, even when doing so undermines Starfleet's chain of command. The flagship model's long-term sustainability depends on the Federation's ability to maintain the industrial and political infrastructure required to support it. Building a Galaxy-class or Sovereign-class starship requires years of construction time, vast material resources, and coordination across multiple Federation shipyards. The investment is justified on the grounds that the flagship serves critical strategic and symbolic functions. But the investment also locks Starfleet into a pattern where the flagship consumes resources that could be distributed across the fleet. During the Dominion War, Starfleet prioritized building tactical vessels over explorers. The Defiant class, the Akira class, and the Steamrunner class were designed for combat, not exploration. They were cheaper to build, faster to deploy, and more tactically versatile than Galaxy-class or Sovereign-class vessels. The shift in production priorities reflected the operational reality that winning the war required numbers, firepower, and flexibility, not symbolic reassurance. The Enterprise E continued to serve, but it was not central to the war effort. Its absence from major engagements was a tacit acknowledgement that the flagship model is less valuable during total war than during peacetime operations. The war ended. The flagship model was restored. Starfleet resumed construction of large explorers, and the Enterprise E returned to high-visibility missions. The resumption was not driven by tactical necessity. It was driven by the need to restore the symbolic architecture that had been suspended during the war. The Federation needed to signal that the crisis had passed, that normal operations had resumed, and that the flagship was once again central to Starfleet's mission. The signal was politically valuable, but it required accepting the same inefficiencies and vulnerabilities that had characterized the flagship model before the war. The flagship is not Starfleet's greatest asset, it is Starfleet's most visible compromise. It reflects the tension between what the Federation is and what it needs to appear to be. That tension has been managed through institutional momentum, command competence, and a willingness to accept risks that would be unacceptable for any other vessel. But tension managed is not tension resolved, and the longer the flagship model persists, the more deeply embedded it becomes in Starfleet's strategic doctrine, the more difficult it will be to move beyond it when the cost of maintaining it finally exceeds the benefit. The Enterprise will be rebuilt, the name will endure, the symbolic function will continue, but the mechanism will remain unchanged. Flagships will be deployed not only where they are needed, but where they can be seen. They will be protected not only because they are valuable, but because their loss would be narratively unacceptable, and they will continue to operate under constraints that do not apply to the rest of the fleet, constraints that prioritize the appearance of strength over the reality of strategic flexibility. The Federation believes the flagship represents its values, but values do not require a single ship to embody them. They require a commitment that extends across the entire fleet, across every starbase, and across every officer who serves. The flagship is not the best expression of that commitment, it is the most visible one. And visibility is not the same as strength. It is the need to be seen being strong. And that need, more than any adversary, more than any technological limitation, is what constrains the Federation's ability to act in its own best interest. The flagship endures because the myth endures. And the myth endures because the Federation has never been willing to let it go.